Hello, and welcome to another episode of Genre Grinder. This week, or month, I should say, I already messed it up. This month, I am joined by Jim Laczkowski. Jim, do you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Jim Laczkowski. How you doing, Gabe?
Pretty good.
It's an honor to be speaking with you on your excellent new show here. I think the last time we talked was way back for Directors Club when we covered the work of Stuart Gordon.
Yep, that would have been the last recording we did.
Yeah, that was a good talk, a good time, and since then, I wound up leaving Directors Club and sort of turning it over to two other guys who are doing a bang up job in their own right. It's a completely different show now, but
Right.
I'm definitely happy to still keep it going in some capacity, but I don't actively podcast as much. However, I do have like a sporadic interview show that I like to do called Voices and Visions, which basically just me trying to interview various people. I definitely recommend the Keith Gordon interviews that I've done because he's turned out to be one of my favorite people to talk movies with, to the point where I'm like, you should just have your own podcast because you know your stuff and you're passionate and you're a great conversationalist, and he's made great movies in his own right. So I always like to steer people in that direction when it comes to that show. And of course, I try to maintain the Now Playing Network the best that I can. Haven't been as active on social media to promote all the podcasts the way I used to, but it's still going. NowPlayingNetwork.net is a nice home for your great show and among many others.
We're talking about nuclear Holocaust movies, but more specifically, in the early 80s, at the height of the Cold War and the paranoia, exploitation movies, art house movies, and mainstream as you can get TV movies all converged with a series of nuclear Holocaust stories. Well, many of these films were inspired by science fiction of the 50s and more action-y, pulpy movies that would have been released also in the 50s, but into the 80s. Some were focused on realistic and sobering portrayals of nuclear war on a street level and to people who weren't actually involved in the warfare. So since post-apocalyptic movies covers a wide range of things, including your zombie movies, your Dawn of the Dead, as I just mentioned, and your Mad Maxes, and your all the new thing being like Bird Box and A Quiet Place, where you have post-apocalyptic monster situations where there's some reason you can't. Actually, I can't remember. Was Bird Box apocalyptic? Doesn't matter.
Yeah, kinda.
It was on its way there.
Yeah.
Situations where there's monsters or something. And then there's also Godzilla movies where the monster is the metaphor, that kind of thing. And there's also more serious movies about the lead up to a nuclear exchange from the point of view of technical staff or in the military, like Sidney Lumet's Failsafe and Kubrick's Dr. Strangelove, both 1964, both based on the same book, more or less. Or The China Syndrome.
Oh, that's a great one.
Which is about an eventually averted nuclear meltdown. Or the HBO series, which in a roundabout way did sort of remind me that I wanted to cover this subject, but we're not covering the true story of how things break down like that. These are no documentaries, and with one exception, none of these are based on real events. And most of them were made in a period in the 1980s between basically 1983 and 1988, I think is the oldest one we're going to cover at length. But I should say, when we were breaking this down, I had a couple more movies from the early 60s, and Jim ended up watching them. And so before we get into the meat here, Jim wanted to talk quickly about This Is Not a Test, directed in 1962, and Panic in Year Zero, also 1962.
Yeah, well, This Is Not a Test. I saw this on YouTube, and kind of not the best quality. but it was really dated. I mean, I thought the
Yeah.
acting kind of left a lot to be desired. And much like Panic in Year Zero, the score was really bombastic.
So it might have even just. It's possible it wasn't even original score.
Yeah, that could be. But the one of the main protagonists is this really stoic state trooper, and he's just like, "Hey, do you think you were driving a bit fast, lady?" Just like every line he delivers is just practically monotone. But at the same time, I really like movies where there's this set group of people with different personalities panicking in various ways, and they're very reactionary and second guess one another. Probably goes back to my love of The Thing, Carpenter's The Thing, where it's like, you form these various cliques and everybody has their own quirk.
It's
to some degree.
It's like the Scary Movie variant on the bottle episode of a sitcom.
Yeah, no, exactly, yeah.
Or I think you would say that one of the earlier movie versions is probably Lifeboat, Hitchcock's Lifeboat.
Sure.
I'm sure it way predates that, but
Yeah.
it sounds like what you're saying is these movies, even though they were made in the 60s, they probably were even dated at the time.
Yeah, it just feels. I don't think that they got the tone exactly right throughout the entire film, but it's I really like the setup because it does remind me of something like The Mist, where it's just a bunch of people panicking and trying to figure out how they're going to cope with what's going on around them. And I always approve of characters when they use the word ruckus quite a bit. And I give This Is Not a Test props for ending on quite a dour note, because I guess it's always shocking when films from this era really just do decide to be this dark or have some sort of element that you just feels out of place for that era. Because I mean, not that you expect sunshine, happy endings for every movie made in that time, but I always go back to the example of when I first saw the Apartment from Billy Wilder, and the doctor is just slapping Shirley MacLaine around in the face, and there's just something about seeing something like that in that time period that really, I feel like I'm being slapped in the face. So this film, it's not. I don't recommend it because again, like, the tone isn't consistent enough, and the acting is pretty bad, and kind of stilted, and just some lines are delivered very like these people don't really act well, period. But Panic in Year Zero, on the other hand, I think when you have Ray Milland at the center, right there, that'll grab you. I think he's a really charismatic and compelling actor, and he does the best he can with this material.
And he directed it.
Yeah, too. And he directed it, and that's something I hadn't known until I started watching it. It's like, wow. But it's weird to watch now because it really romanticizes guns and protection and protecting your family in a really violent manner, and just always making sure that you're prepared to attack somebody in a reactionary defensive way. But at the same time, there's that element of like, well, how are we going to deal with this? Are we going to isolate ourselves in this little like pocket in this like almost like a cave on a beach that they sort of decide to hold up in and just sort of wait things out? Or are they going to try to, acclimate themselves back into society, try to figure out what to do? It's like, they basically wanted to go on this nice vacation, and then they realize that all communication's been cut off back home, and they can't contact anybody, and word gets out, and it's them like trying to figure out how to get supply. Like, I like the minutia of how we, step by step, how are we going to do this? How are we going to do that? How are we going to even get from point A to point B? That kind of stuff is really interesting. But for that movie, what really kills it is the score. It's got like these blaring horns and saxophones that don't really help things. They don't really heighten the tension and confrontational moments, which there are many of. There are many of people just coming out of the woodwork, or these hoodlums coming out to attack the women in the family and stuff like that. But I mean, in terms of if you're a Ray Milland fan, I think you'll want to watch this, and I think you'll be curious to see his directorial debut. But from what I read, he was pretty overwhelmed. He was not ready to take on the task of acting and directing at the same time. And it kind of shows. It kind of shows that it didn't really find its footing throughout.
It sounds to me like it's a little bit trapped between being a 50s B movie and being a 60s message movie. Yeah,
with some melodrama thrown in there. That, yeah, I mean, sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. It's kind of interesting to see, like, you know, the beach bum star Frankie Avalon, who would kind of go go on to be on all those beach movies. He's like a teenager in this. But again, like, really the only person that stands out is Ray Milland, and it does end on a kind of a optimistic note about, like, they're going to finally find refuge and things are going to be okay, and that to me felt appropriate for that film. This is not a test. It's just like, fuck it, it's all over.
Yeah. People might be hearing in the background what sounds like screams. That is not a nuclear holocaust. I live near the pool, and it's a very hot weekend day when we're recording this. So there are children and teenagers out at the pool screaming, even though I have my door closed and it is about 40 yards away. They're just being that loud, but we'll ignore them. And you might hear my cat too at one point because he's very elderly.
Yeah, it was a lovely kitty, I'm sure.
Yeah, he's all right.
But I wanted to ask you really quickly, though. What was your first experience, or kind of when were you first exposed to something in a film that involved, like, total human annihilation?
Boy, I hadn't thought about that. Well, I definitely did not see any of these movies as a kid. My parents protected me from that. I was a very nervous kid, so I basically wasn't allowed to see much of anything until I was much older. So I would have to say it was probably the third Mad Max movie, Thunderdome, Beyond Thunderdome, where I saw that at a party, and it sort of dawned on me. And I was probably already 9 or 10 years old by that point, and it sort of dawned on me that there was entertainment based on what happened after some sort of nuclear blast, like some sort of society having to be rebuilt situation. I can't think of anything I would have seen earlier than that.
Yeah,
I had seen The Terminator, so that probably gave me an idea too.
Well, that's what I was going to say is, my dad was like, by the time I turned 6 or 7, you're fine, you can watch these action movies or anything along those lines that you want to. And, I definitely saw The Terminator first, but I think seeing that sequence in Terminator 2, that dream sequence, in an opening night in a crowded theater, not expecting something that graphic and bodies on fire and exploding, that was something that qualified as pure horror for me. That's mostly in this kind of action / comedy at times because of I would call Terminator 2 a half comedy. There's a lot of laughs in it for sure. There's a lot of levity throughout. Well, the interesting thing about that movie is that I think it's aimed at preteens for the most part. I could see that. Its R rating is sort of an accident practically. It's like that shot, which is on the TV version, and I think 2 of the Terminator, the T-1000 stabs 2 people. That probably got at the R rating, I guess. That was heavy. But that was definitely one of my first experiences with that visual, and taking that with me afterwards and going, oh fuck.
Well, I actually used to draw that image all the time. As a tween. So I guess it did have a pretty I never thought about that before, but I would draw little images of skeletons getting blasted by something. That was a pretty common. I could draw skeletons like nobody's business by the time I was 13. So, maybe that did affect me more than I thought.
And more recently, that Twin Peaks episode from the last season, episode 8.
I still haven't seen it, so
I'm not going to give it. I'm not going to give anything away. No, I won't give it away. But there's something that happens that that unnerved me to no end, and when you do catch up, you'll see what I mean.
The Chernobyl series did a pretty good job.
Yeah, I've been meaning to watch
dreadful.
that. I watched the first episode, and I just need to keep going with it. It was, but I'm expecting it to only get more graphic and heavy as it goes on.
Yeah, it doesn't pull punches. That's for sure.
No, I don't doubt it.
But yeah, I guess there aren't that many movies about nuclear meltdowns in that way. They're usually about bomb drops.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, only one of the movies we're going to talk about here isn't about a dropped bomb. And that would be Countdown to Looking Glass. I don't think the bomb isn't dropped. Anyway, so the first movie I want to talk about, even though it's not the first one in order of release, is The Day After, which is directed by Nicholas Meyer. And it was a made-for-TV movie, and it is the quintessential, in my opinion, 80s nuclear scare movie because it aired on ABC November 20th, 1983, and it had more than 100 million people see it. And I don't think that record has been beaten for a made-for-TV movie. And then it had a pretty big life on VHS, and it was shown in theaters in other countries. It was a pretty big deal when it was released.
We have a massive attack against the U.S. at this time. ICBMs. Over 300 missiles inbound now.
Either we fired first and they're going to try to hit what's left. But they fired first and we just got our missiles out of the ground in time.
One millisecond takes you beyond imagining, beyond tomorrow, and into the day after.
The screenplay is credited to Edward Hume, but Nicholas Meyer would have been hired because of his strength writing and directing Star Trek II Wrath of Khan the year before in 1982. And he was a screenwriter novelist, so my assumption has always been that he rewrote a considerable amount of this particular screenplay. And The Day After depicts a full-on nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union from the point of view of a small town. In this case, the college town of Lawrence, Kansas, and then there's some scenes that take place in Kansas City, Missouri.
Oh, right, yeah.
And this sort of sets the tone for a lot of the movies we're going to talk about, where it is a small group of people, in this case, a couple pockets of small groups of people who have no control over the situation, and there will be a build-up to the actual explosions and that's usually the scariest part, honestly, is the dread when you realize it's coming.
Oh yeah, no, it definitely gets to you, and I think the pacing of this isn't quite the best.
Well, I will say straight out at the beginning here, I think this is kind of a bad movie. It's a bad movie that does its job very well, and I don't think it's Nicholas Meyer's fault. I think it's just something you couldn't do to the full extent of what needed to be done on television. And also it was meant to be a two-parter, and they crammed it into 2 hours.
That could explain the pacing issues and something being off.
I'm sure that, and from what I understand, the closest we ever got to a director's cut was a 126-minute version, so there's only like 6 extra minutes.
Yeah, I think that was recently released too on Blu-ray.
Yeah. And so it's a movie that is hampered, but I think still has a certain power to it.
Yeah, certainly. Whenever we talk about a movie like this, and we're going to be talking about it, the thing that's what happens when the bomb hits and the visuals that are presented to you, and how it's always going to get to me. It's always going to, even when, the effects are dated or something along those lines, just knowing that, this person immediately died and has been immediately erased from existence is something that it's even hard to process. And I'm like, separate yourself from this idea, because it's pretty safe to say that we're always going to live in some regard, because we know nuclear weapons still exist, and it's just always going to be in the back of our minds, and so it'll always have some sort of visceral effect on you, just seeing a community of people either they die or they outright have to deal with the aftermath of everything. And For me,
it's always
for me,
it's that situation. Which is worse? Which is worse, being fried by nuclear fire or having to deal with a destroyed world and radiation sickness?
Yeah. Well,
and this movie is almost half and half.
Yeah,
I would say.
yeah, and it's slow going in ways that I kind of anticipated, because you do have to get to know a lot of the characters and their, interior lives, and that sort of builds some investment. But at the same time, it's like, do I really care about Steve Guttenberg? I don't know.
Well, yeah, and that's an interesting thing to me too, is that it was purposely, they tried to hire mostly unknown actors. Apparently Jason Robards was the one big star, and his role isn't even that big.
Surprisingly, yeah.
In the time since the movie was released, Steve Guttenberg, John Lithgow, Amy Madigan, even Jo Beth Williams as the kid, because she would appear in Poltergeist soon after.
Sure, yeah.
Stephen Furst is in this.
Right.
They've all become recognizable. I would say few are huge stars, other than maybe Lithgow, but they've all become very recognizable. So it doesn't do it any favors in the modern era. And at the time, these people would have been less well known.
Yeah, and it does feel long, but still, when it happens, it does carry a lot of emotional weight. And seeing people that sick or just that in a state of panic and fear is just something that makes these films pretty consistently effective, even if the overall film itself is kind of weak, especially when you compare it to something like Threads, which I feel like does this way better.
Well, the one thing for me that works about The Day After is that I believe John Lithgow's character, and I have to admit I didn't rewatch it just before we recorded. I had seen it last year. The John Lithgow character is a professor, I believe.
Yeah.
And he is, at one point, he's explaining to people that if we see the nukes coming up in Kansas, that means the nukes in Russia have already launched. Or that that Russia will know that the nukes are launching in Kansas and they will launch theirs. So if the nukes are coming up in Kansas, they're already doomed, and it's just a matter of time.
Yeah.
And there's a good shot where the special effects might be dated, but it doesn't really matter, where Lithgow sees the nukes going up. It's not Lithgow, it's a different character. And the audience, because it's been established, knows that means there's a ticking clock and that there's only a certain amount of time to get to safety. And anybody who knows anything about nuclear war, which probably most of the audience didn't, knows that even if you get to safety, there's not a lot of good news after that.
Yeah, and I think the ticking clock element definitely adds a lot to the proceedings here, and certainly does when we talk about one of my favorites, obviously, later on.
Well, and that's another reason why it loses steam after that, because after the bombs drop, there's no more ticking clock, and the movie doesn't really know how to end.
Yeah, other than just showing the devastation, and the ending it's just there. I mean,
it's not a good or bad really ending. It's bleak, but not the bleakest, I would say.
Yeah.
This movie did famously contribute to de-escalation, though, and Ronald Reagan was vocal about he was shown it before it went on television. I suppose most of the army was shown it before it went on television because it was about to show to hundreds of millions of people. And he said it made him depressed.
Yeah.
And they even made sure it aired on Soviet television at one point about a year later. So even if it's not a great movie, it did what Meyer wanted it to do.
Yeah, and it definitely plays at times, I mean, as a statement and something that it's a cautionary tale, but it's also just like, hey, we shouldn't do this, guys. And here's why, and here's what could possibly happen, and just to see it right before your eyes, even though it's only a movie, you still feel it, and you still quantify it as a horror film, because if any of this did happen in our lives, it would be horrific, and I'm glad that it had that impact in the way that it did.
But as you say, it did pull some punches in a way that Mick Jackson's Threads does not. And Threads was released a year later in 1984, and it's essentially the same story. In fact, for all we know, you could pretend this is the same war, the same fictional war, but this is from working class town of Sheffield, England's point of view.
There's growing evidence overnight from scientists and observers in many countries that there have been 2 nuclear explosions in the Middle East.
This time, they are playing with, at best, the destruction of life as we know it, and at worst, total annihilation. You cannot win a nuclear war!
The time has now come to make everything ready for you and your family in case an air attack happens. When you hear the attack warning, you and your family must take cover at once. The most widespread danger is fallout.
Quite good.
Attack warning.
Attack warning? Is it for real? Attack warning? It's for bloody real. Is it?
You can't just do a face like that. Go get a titty sign or something.
They had less money to make it. But this actually, I think, in a way, with the exception of the special effects, which they usually work around, they were able to do it on a smaller scale. They were allowed to show more real violence, and even though it was censored for its television release, but it has this just, it breaks your soul to watch this movie for the first time.
Yeah.
I've seen it probably 3 or 4 times, so I finally was able to.
Are you okay?
I was able over the years to get past. Well, there was a time when this was a movie I was seeking out, and it was not easily available on US VHS.
Yeah, it was hard to find.
And I ended up, there was a place, I ended up finding a bootleg copy at a place that had rented bootleg copies of horror movies and stuff, because I was at that age where I wanted to challenge myself with how much could I take kind of situation. And I had already dealt with all the gore movies, so what was left was serious, disturbing movies. And so yeah, the first couple of times I saw it, it was I'm finally at the point where I'm able to watch this as a technical exercise, but it's still, having just come out on Blu-ray, the extra added detail and widescreen framing. Oh no, it's not widescreen. The extra added detail does add, even more gruesomeness to the ideas behind it.
And it's from the director of The Bodyguard and L.A. Story.
Yes.
Like what?
Well, and it was partially, from what I understand, it was partially inspired by another movie I put on the list and you watched and I didn't, called The War Game.
Yes.
And now The War Game was BBC. It was more of a docudrama, right?
Yeah, kind of like a mockumentary of sorts, mixed with these dramatic elements and a lot of voiceover. It's just like, again, the anticipation of a nuclear attack, leads to all of these mass evacuations, and then the missile goes off and many people are blinded and often talk into the camera, talking about, what they're feeling, what they're experiencing, and you get to see how horribly wounded they are and just everybody trying to deal with the shock and lots of crying. It's very meticulous in the way it's put together. And it's clearly meant to be this warning about the impending possibilities, but it's pretty intense. It's like I said, interviews and really memorable black and white imagery. That's the thing too that kind of stood out with it, was just a lot of the films we saw were in color, and this one, there was just something about watching it in black and white that stood out. There were just a lot of very memorable images of like these raging firestorms and how disfigured people are, the radiation poisoning, and just a lot of the stuff you would come to expect and that we do see prolonged in something like Threads. So this is just basically like an extension of what was done in The War Game without sort of the mockumentary approach.
Though at the same time, they do maintain a lot of the narration aspects, which in a way makes Threads also just a better movie on a objective scale from Day After, because after the bomb drops, Threads has a way of breaking down the years following. So we do follow characters and see that these certain characters have been affected by this, and some of them have died immediately and others had survived. but it also starts to break down what would happen later. And there's a narrator who explains. And to me, this is some of the most powerful stuff, because this really detached voice is basically saying it in no uncertain terms that no, this doom does not end with the initial bomb drops or even the years following, but there's probably going to be clouds over the earth that will keep plants from growing, and we'll run out of food at this point, and then we'll run out of water at this point, and animals will start going extinct at this point. That kind of continuing dread makes it to me even worse, even if it wasn't, because it's not in black and white, but it has it's very grainy. It's, I think, 16 millimeter.
Mm-hmm. It's very grainy.
And it's also Sheffield, England, so it's pretty dismal already. So it has a gray quality, but the color is sort of sucked out after. At a certain point, the only colors you're seeing are nuclear fire and blood, basically.
Yeah.
And so that, I think, even adds more to it. It's a better made movie than Day After all around.
And it'll mess you up 100%. I think you kind of hope it's going to, like you're talking about, at least, leave you with the sense of, well, life will go on and humanity will persevere. Actually,
no,
life
probably
doesn't
not.
Go on, it gets worse, and if this were to happen, there's just pretty much no sense of coming together and figuring out what to do from here. It's just you're screwed. It's just you're going to be in constant despair or trying to figure out how to stay alive, and you may not be able to.
Yeah, and your children's children. I mean, it gets to the point where her kid.
Yeah.
One survivor, it's almost like it could have gone on for much longer, because we could have followed her children and her children's children. But you get the feeling that there's just not going to be any people left at a certain point.
Yeah.
Which is not a feeling any of these other movies gave me.
Yeah, I mean, it touches upon birth defects and just the things that would very likely occur. But it's just... it's bleak with a capital B, and that's what I think. Watching this was like, I need at least a week off from anything similar. But I think it's definitely one of the better examples of this type of film.
And so just actually before The Day After, the first in this line of these made-for-TV dramas, Lynne Littman's Testament, which was released in 1983. A little bit before The Day After, was in production before that. It was made to be a PBS production. Similar to The Threads was a BBC production, but Paramount decided to release it in theaters. And to me, it's actually the most made for TV of all three of the movies here, in this sort of little tiny pantheon of melodramatic society crumbling kind of movies.
It was a day like any other. Televisions glowed, radios blared. Breakfasts were being served. Children were playing. Everything was as it should be. When suddenly, it could never be that way again.
And I think that Testament, it doesn't fit because it's not, it doesn't quite fit because it's not as pushing the boundaries. It doesn't push the boundaries as hard as either Day After or, of course, not Threads. And it's also sort of a little soap opera-y, but it is anchored on an incredibly good central performance.
Yeah, I wanted to explore more of Jane Alexander's work after seeing this, and it's funny. I can't remember. Maybe I think it was Joe Dante. He said on a podcast, he mentioned this movie, and for some reason I hadn't heard of it before. I was like, I feel like this would be totally up my radar and something that I would seek out. But
it doesn't have the cult following the other two do.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I found this on Amazon Prime, and I sat down to watch it, and I was kind of blown away but this time by the acting, and even just some side characters, obviously familiar faces like Kevin Costner and Rebecca De Mornay, but little Lucas Haas.
And Haas is very good. And well, part of it is okay. So this one is lighter weight as far as the depictions of Fallout go, because it is another small town, but it's a small town that's 90 minutes away from San Francisco.
Right.
So they have a good distance between them and an actual drop. So there's not a lot of the bombast in this one. And it follows, is she a housewife? I can't remember off the top of my head.
I believe so. Yeah. And her husband goes away on a business trip.
Yeah. And he's away in San Francisco, I believe. And so she's with the kids, and she has so much, again, Jane Alexander, the actress Jane Alexander, she has so much chemistry with the two kids.
Oh, yeah.
That's a realistic chemistry. It's not a cutesy chemistry at all.
Yeah. And I think that's just the little touches and just the graceful kind of panning of the living room environment before things happen, and even just the use of an answering machine in this too. I just like the little attention to detail that made it feel like, oh, this was what my home was like back in the 80s. Made me feel a sense of connection, a stronger emotional connection to this and this family, and certainly, what happens to some of them. It really floored me, and I think that I would agree that there's the lifetimey kind of quality to it at times, and it's made for TV feel. But it actually, I don't know, it didn't really deter from me because of that performance, and because it's so focused on different reactions once again, like they all get together in a church and sort of...
And it's really centered on her as a person.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. You can
it has all these other characters, but it's not dividing its attention between them like Threads and Day After do. I mean, at certain points, I can't even tell the characters apart in Threads or Day After, which is sort of the point because they're all covered in black soot.
Yeah.
But in this one, we're very focused on her, and the fallout hits them, so it's all radiation poisoning. So it's an unseen destruction.
Yeah,
and
like a disease.
People get sick, and you can't stop them from getting sick. And that's a certain kind of... I'm not a parent, but I know a lot of parents, and I've worked with children for years. I understand that helplessness of a sick child, and you can't figure out how to stop it, which is what radiation would do to people in small towns outside of major drop zones like San Francisco or LA. I mean, I grew up in Tucson, which would have been bombed because there was a major Air Force base, as what we were always told. So I was 90 minutes from the nearest big city, which is Phoenix. But we were all Air Force stuff there, so we would have been bombed. But I imagine a lot of the people I know grew up in these smaller towns that are closer. I don't think it's a real city that they live in. I think it's a made-up town.
Yeah, I think it's called Hamlin or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, and also just just characters who pop in or show up, and I know Hiroshi is this character who has developmentally disabled, might have Down syndrome,
right?
But doesn't, they don't treat him as like in a very inauthentic way. It's just he's really a really sweet character that's kind of just trying to process this in a different way than everybody else is, and I just found like all their interactions together and, the need to sort of stick together as a family really, really worked, even if it's more dramatic and less about, the fallout and the nuclear threat. It's just more about how do people cope with this type of trauma and this type of tragedy and manage to do it together. But yeah, this one definitely wrecked me. It's higher up on my list of recommendations of this type of film we're talking about.
And I should mention that Jane Alexander was nominated for Best Actress. I think that's a big deal. She was up against Meryl Streep for Silkwood, Julie Walters for Educating Rita, Deborah Winger for Terms of Endearment, and Shirley MacLaine also for Terms of Endearment.
Oh wow!
And I'm not a big fan of Terms of Endearment like a lot of people are. I think I'm also not a very big fan of Educating Rita.
Yeah, that one's all right, but I do like Terms.
Silkwood, Meryl Streep. What I'm trying to say is I think she actually deserved.
I do too.
Because I think Meryl Streep can win again at some point. She doesn't need to win for Silkwood.
Clearly. I mean, yeah, I do love Deborah Winger. You know, but seeing this, I was just kind of, wow. This is not the kind of performance I expected.
And it's not a big tearful one.
Right.
Like, I need to make that clear. This is a very centered, realistic
internalized
performance that just runs the whole movie in a good way, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like if it was almost if this one role didn't work, this would be a very bad movie, I think. But it works so well that it holds it all together. It's
paced just right, and it's I think it's only like an hour and a half.
Yeah, they're all three of the three we're talking about. Actually, most of these movies are pretty short. I don't think any of these movies are more than 100 minutes long.
I felt like The Day After was a lot longer.
Yeah, you're right. The Day After's 2 hours. You're right.
Yeah.
It was gonna be 4 hours, and it's 2 hours. Yeah.
Well, if it had been split into 2 parts, I could see maybe that working in its favor.
2 nights in a row.
Yeah.
So those are that's the trilogy of the made-for-TV melodramas. But then we also had 2 made-for-TV mockumentaries. And we're actually going to talk about them out of order because... we are going to talk about them in the right order. The first one is called Special Bulletin, and it's directed by Edward Zwick. And it was released in 1983. And so actually, technically, this one came before Testament or The Day After. They're all within months of each other, though. So it's all obviously this was in the ether.
We interrupt our regular programming to bring you this special bulletin from RBS News.
Good morning. This is Susan Miles in New York. There's a rapidly unfolding situation in Charleston, South Carolina this morning, where an unidentified group is holding 4 hostages on board a ship. Apparently, they are demanding to make a statement live over the RBS network. Megan Barclay is in Charleston and has more on that story.
I'm going to go on record and say I think this is Edward Zwick's best movie.
I would agree.
Zwick is known for making big, very lush, fancy Oscar bait movies about white saviors.
You think?
He directed Glory. Yeah. He directed The Last Samurai. He directed Blood Diamond. He directed the I can't remember what it's called. It's about the
is it Defiance?
Polish, Defiance, which I thought was terrible.
Yeah,
it's just an awful movie.
I did too.
He directs those kinds of movies, and they're usually good-looking but really bland movies where you'd rather watch a movie about the cultures where the white people are visiting than the white people themselves. But for this, I think this is maybe my favorite from a movie standpoint of all the TV movies we're going to talk about. And it caught me really off guard how good it actually is, because I just assumed a made-for-TV mockumentary from the 80s by Edward Zwick was going to be pretty over-the-top bad, to tell you the truth.
Oh, sure. No, I was kind of in the same boat. And again, as it went along, I was kind of like, wow, this is way more intense than I expected to be. And again, we do have a ticking clock sort of element to it. Like we know it's coming.
Right. This one is more of a thriller. It's not a
it's like a
about,
terrorist situation.
Yeah, a group of anti-war group has gotten their hands on an H-bomb and are going to detonate it off the coast of South Carolina. Again, take a break there for a second. South Carolina. This movie takes place in South Carolina. I think this is an important aspect of these movies, that we have one that takes place in Northern California, not a major city. We have one that takes place in Sheffield, England, not London. We have one that takes place in Kansas City and Lawrence, Kansas, not Chicago.
Yeah.
Now we're in South Carolina, and we're not even in a major city, but we're off the coast of South Carolina.
It's going to be detonated at sea practically.
Yeah, and so they're going to detonate this H-bomb if there's not major disarmament of important. They don't want. They know the terrorists are just smart enough to know that they can't ask the government to disarm everything, but they want specific disarmaments, or they're going to blow up this bomb. and a TV crew goes to cover it and is taken hostage. And so the idea is that this would be something you would see on television. You'd be watching TV and you would watch a special bulletin.
Yeah.
And it would just become all you watched on TV that day, because they would just postpone all the soap operas and all the game shows because you had a TV crew in there, and they're consistently in communication with the terrorists. And so we get to know the TV crew and the terrorists and the news crew back at the studio in, I think, a very efficient fashion. We know what we needed to know about these people without them telling us a bunch of backstory.
Yeah, that I think created a sense of immediacy with everything. I mean, you kind of expect that with this type of framing, just like, okay, you know, shaky cam, and certainly just like the news broadcast backdrop.
Right.
And just like their immediate, you could see the reporters and, you know, the telecasters, just everybody's reaction to things happening in the moment on their face.
Right.
And I think that, you know, that creates a real sense of empathy for everybody. And once again, when it happens, I was really taken aback by how effective it turned out to be, because you're working with a limited budget, and certainly the, you know, grainy mockumentary approach. I think it enhances it. It enhances the realism of.
I think also the fact that it's a thriller and
not
a war movie, that you really don't think it's going to happen.
That's
you really
true.
think
That's
they're
true.
going to solve the problem, but the bomb goes off. One of the terrorists is emotionally completely unsound, and at the same time, the military and police handling the situation are being really gung ho about it. So those two things mixed, and the bomb does go off.
Yeah, when the bomb squad goes in there and starts working on it, you think, well, maybe this will end good.
At a certain point, you realize, oh, wait, there's still like 15, 20 minutes left in this movie. I don't think they're going to fix this.
Yeah. Yeah, and nobody really showboats here. I mean, it's really just kind of a incredibly well-acted scenario. Who's the guy from The Thing? Speaking of The Thing, I think he's the leader of the terrorists.
Yeah, and he's the one who's kind of unhinged in his.
Yeah. He's pretty great in this.
Yeah.
But I want to say, did this have not necessarily the same impact on people who watched it, but it was akin to something like what Orson Welles did with the War of the Worlds radio broadcast. I mean, I think people knew that this wasn't real, but I think just the realism of the way it's portrayed certainly got to people that did see it.
Well, I had never heard of this one until I started looking into this, and this would have been, I watched a bunch of these in a row already last year when I reviewed the Blu-ray of Threads. I decided I wanted to be the expert on this subject. But the interesting thing is I told my mother, who is not a movie person, especially not an obscure movie person, that I was going to do this podcast, and she said, "Oh, are you going to talk about that made-for-TV movie?" And I assumed she meant The Day After. But then she started describing it, and I realized she was talking about this, which I don't remember ever seeing. So she must have seen this, and it affected her. So the people who did see this, remember it. And I think, and it's not available. It's available on manufactured on-demand DVD from the Warner Archive.
Yeah.
But this is all the people who talk about the made mockumentary and found footage stuff. I think this is like top tier found footage horror in a way. There's not a lot of on-screen mayhem, but the way it is done, this is what I would have wanted if they would have made like actual sequels to the movie Cloverfield, instead of pseudo universe, whatever this garbage they're doing is now. This is what I would have wanted out of an actual sequel, is maybe not even a different event, but the exact same event, but just like, because this reminds me of, the closest I can get is watching TV when 9/11 happened and switching through channels, and it's everything. It's everything you're watching. There's no other TV shows on during this event. and you have people on the street, and then there's this certain point where the second tower fell, and there were actual news crews there. Like,
I do wonder if people were to watch this now, having gone through something like that, it would carry an even. It's probably why it got to us even more, to some degree, because we went through something where we were watching this horrific, horrible thing happen right in front of our eyes, and seeing all the news coverage and special bulletins. It just made it all both surreal and difficult to process in the moment. And I imagine that would hold true if this event were to actually occur. And then certainly once the bomb goes off and you do see people severely hurt, it's kind of a shock and awe, no pun intended, situation.
It doesn't revel in the gore
No.
and the stuff, but there is some of it there, and there is, you see the news crew realizing, or I should say the people back at the studio realizing what happened
and being in shock.
And they're trying to warn their other guy on the field to get out of there at one point, and that the footage they have of their one camera setup getting bashed by the shockwave is just like, that's on level, that sequence is on the level of Cannibal Holocaust and the Blair Witch Project, as far as I'm concerned. As for that sort of found footage horror, like this could have happened kind of impact, just awful feeling that you get.
Do you see it too as kind of a critique on the media? Because that certainly wasn't something, once something like Natural Born Killers came out, it was all bets are off when it came to that. But I think early on, and when this came out, I don't know if that was necessarily as an issue, or concern, I should say.
Well, it's not remembered as such, but Cannibal Holocaust was made as a critique on media, and that is in a lot of ways the granddaddy of all these movies, even though none of them are anything like it. I think that most mockumentary style found footage movies are in a certain way a critique on the way media covers this kind of stuff.
Yeah. No, but this is definitely a must. It's not easy to find.
No, but it is findable. It is on DVD. It was. I didn't see it streaming anywhere, and I didn't find like a bootleg on YouTube or anything. But I would say this is like the one high recommendation from all that we're going to talk about that I think people maybe haven't seen, other than Threads. But I only recommend Threads to people who think they understand how severe it is. This one I recommend on more of a movie-going level, I think.
And if people are interested in finding the War Game, I actually found it on Vimeo, but it was labeled as War Games.
Okay.
Which
That's
I'm
good
like,
to
hey
know.
guys, this isn't War Games from 1983. Why don't you change the title? And I think there's even comments on there that say that.
Yeah, and War Games is a movie that they don't have the nuclear holocaust happens, so we aren't going to cover that here. But
that's another really good one.
But that fits in this sort of idea of the thriller that leads up to an event like this. The other movie is called Countdown to Looking Glass, which is a cooler title.
Oh, yeah. That is a great title.
That one was released a year later in 1984, and it was made in Canada by Fred Barzyk. Lots of ick names making these.
Canadian.
And that had... I assume this one was even more inspired by the China Syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see that for sure.
But this one's a little more strict in its the way it approaches the movie. It takes place entirely as a newscast.
Yeah.
And it's a series of newscasts as well.
And I didn't think necessarily that was a good idea.
No, I don't think it works. I think it's an interesting experiment.
Yeah.
It's like these live... It feels like live TV. Like, it feels like this was something that they decided to do live, but it wasn't. It was recorded and edited. If this would have been a live TV event, I think it would have been a little bit more... I would be able to overlook that so much of it doesn't work out.
Yeah, and unlike Special Bulletin, it's not that okay, an actor like Michael Murphy, everybody knows or something, but having a couple of familiar faces, including Scott Glenn.
Yeah, you're not going to believe Scott Glenn is just a random newscaster.
Right. So I think that there was a little separation there for me. But they're great. They're great actors, and I think people here do their best. But
they did hire actual Canadian newscasters.
True. Yeah.
Too. Yeah. It's weird that they interspersed them with Michael Murphy, Helen Shaver, and Scott Glenn.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of it doesn't work.
Yeah, I don't know if that was a great idea in the execution, but certainly something that I maybe if I'd watched it before Special Bulletin, I might have responded to it stronger.
Yeah, I watched them in that order too. You're right. It's even harder to find. I imagine it's on Canadian DVD.
I think it's on YouTube. Yeah.
Is it just on YouTube?
Yeah.
That might have been where I watched it too.
Yeah.
Actually, now that I think about it. But it's kind of another interesting thing about this one is instead of nuclear war occurring because of usually it's something happens in Afghanistan that triggers it in a lot of these movies.
Mm-hmm.
This time it's actually a banking crisis.
Right.
Which, that's an interesting touch to kind of imply that it's not, that these kind of things can occur based on events that the general public is not going to usually connect to nuclear exchange.
Mm-hmm.
That war doesn't have to be built off of a smaller version of war. Like it's a skirmish in another country could build to nuclear war, but so could economic sanctions. It has interesting touches and it has an interesting idea, and it's interesting that it's stuck so close to its guns as far as its style, but it's just not a very good movie, I would say.
No, and I will say that like when you sort of kind of end with the emergency broadcast system sound and the fact that it takes over the newscast, I think even to this day when they do that on TV or even just the sirens going off on particular days in the city or something, I still have I know it's not, I know it's just a test, but it's just an effective sound that it means bad news even if it's not really happening and it is just a test. So I think when you decide to go that route, I feel a little response to that, but
yeah,
in general I was disappointed with this one, but I like the title.
Yeah, it's got a cool title. So those were the TV movies we just covered, and we're going to count Testament because it was originally designed to be a TV movie. So there were also 2 animated movies produced around this time that are aimed at the same thing. They are Mori Masaki's Barefoot Gen, which was released in 1983, and Jimmy T. Murakami's When the Wind Blows, which is a British movie released in 1986. And we both watched Barefoot Gen, which I almost didn't want to cover because it follows a true story of what happened during the Hiroshima bomb drop at the end of World War II. And at first I was thinking that this was one of the few movies to talk about that, but I did more research and I realized there's actually quite a few movies about the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And in fact, Barefoot Gen is based on Kaiji Nakazawa's manga that was published throughout 1972 into 1987. It was an ongoing series based on this man's real life experiences as a child after the bomb dropped. I've discovered that there were actually 3 live action adaptations that were made before this animated one that I had never even heard of. And from what I could find, there were no English subtitles available for those. So
the one I found was dubbed, but for Barefoot Gen.
I should say the live action ones, there was no subtitles or dubbing. So I didn't know those movies existed when I said that. So what we're going to do is we're still going to cover Barefoot Gen because I think it was made in the same as the same kind of response to early 80s Cold War paranoia. I think this was the Japanese response to that, because this was a very popular story for years that had never been turned into an animated movie. And I think that they chose this time to do it on purpose. So we're still going to cover it. But then I just want to say that there was also a pantheon of live action dramas about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some of which were made at the height of censorship for what would have been American censorship, because America was occupying the region, and somehow these movies still got out. So I'm very curious about these movies, and I'm going to try to find versions with subtitles, but there just wasn't time to see them before we did this, and there wouldn't have been a place to put them. So that's going to be something separate. I might write something instead. But we're still going to cover Barefoot Gen, which was, again, this was released in 1983. And it had a sequel, which we're not going to talk about, I guess, because I couldn't find it. But this was actually a movie I saw as a teenager because it was dubbed and available at Blockbuster Video.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask if you'd saw this before or after Grave of the Fireflies, since that's what came to mind.
And everybody always thinks of Grave of the Fireflies, which is the better movie, but Grave of the Fireflies by Isawa Takahata is more of a drama, and it was released and produced by Studio Ghibli. And it's not technically about the nuclear drops. It's about the fire bombings that actually preceded it. And it takes place outside of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I can't remember what prefect it takes place in. But that is a very good companion piece with Barefoot Gen, assuming you have a mental ability to watch two movies where children are destroyed by war.
And even before the bomb drops in this, there's this moment where some bastard just like starts hitting this kid in the face for capturing a fish, and I'm just like, man, that's I don't know. Sometimes again, like I just when you don't expect something like that, it really gets to you. But then of course, a half hour in, the bomb drops and my jaw was on the floor. And this time when you're watching it with animation,
well, the animation is very childlike.
Yeah.
But when the bomb drops and people start dying, it gets pretty...
I was not expecting melting eyeballs.
Yep. Melting eyeballs, people falling apart, all that stuff.
Yeah, and babies. Like a baby actually melts at one point. Like a woman has her baby and just like, oh my God.
Yeah.
Yeah. This one definitely works, I would say. I mean...
Yeah, I mean, it gets very stylized when things start blowing up. There's a lot of more cut animation. And it's a style of animation that's not used anymore, basically. It was a very late 70s, early 80s style of TV animation, really. The children look more like something you'd see on Gigantor or Astro Boy. They don't look like the kids you'd see in Totoro.
Yeah, and the dubbing is...
And the dubbing is pretty bad. I've only ever seen the dub version, actually. I meant to watch the subtitled version this time, and I just didn't. I just was too busy, and I needed to do other things, but I wanted to sort of remind myself about it. I've seen this movie too many times, too. It's another one where... so it has a great setup where we see how bad the situation is as the firebombing's happening. But Hiroshima, I guess, didn't get a whole lot of that firebombing. So they were mostly just aware of what was happening, and they were having raids and stuff. But because of the firebombing and because the U.S. was no longer fighting in Europe anymore at this point, it was a very concentrated, really awful effort as far as what was happening to the citizens of Japan. They were just constantly bombarded. So the interesting thing about the story as being told from a child's point of view is there's so many things that children can just go with.
Yeah, adapt.
They can adapt very quickly to awful situations. So the kids are still playing and still trying to go to school. And that setup, though very stylized, I think is really poignant.
Yeah, no, it makes things feel really authentic, and just how do they acclimate and figure out, well, how do we get food for for their mother, and deal with the air raid warnings and things like that. Again, like the little details and the decisions to focus on the relationship too is really smart, because you do care about what happens.
And it has a little bit in common with Testament. Because the father and one of the kids die, two of the kids die, so it's just Gen and his mom and the baby, and then they adopt another kid, which is similar to things that happen after people start dying in Testament.
Yeah, that's true.
The mom sort of takes on other responsibilities. But like The Day After, it doesn't really know how to end. And because it was based on an ongoing series, like I said, this series ran from the 70s well into the 80s. It's 10 volumes when it came to America. And there's a sequel movie, and there were 3 full live-action movies based on it. The story is very long. The bomb drop is only the impetus for what happened later. It goes on for years into rebuilding Japan. So the movie doesn't really know where to end. The bombs drop, they adopt another kid, and then there's sort of like a mini story about them being hired to take care of this man who is severely burned but survived. And the Gen himself gets radiation poisoning, his hair falls out, but he actually gets through it, which was something that some people did. Some people just made it through the radiation poisoning. They didn't die from it, and they didn't get leukemias, or the other thing was thyroid cancers were really common.
I think if I recall, it does end kind of on this optimistic note of, I mean, the wheat is starting to grow, even though they were told it's never going to grow again, and they set that paper boat lantern down the river, and it's like, a nice way to end things. But you're right, it just sort of ends there, and
there's a lot more to the story after this.
Yeah, it feels like it. It feels like there should be more, and I guess. Wow, I hadn't realized there was, a lot to this story, including the sequel and the live action films as well. Yeah.
I mean, if you're interested, again, 10 volumes of manga, and those manga volumes aren't no slouch. Those are some thick books. So, I've never read all of it, but I've never even seen the sequel movie, so I don't exactly know what happens. I just know that the sequel movie takes place over rebuilding Japan.
That would be interesting to dive into.
So the next one is When the Wind Blows, which was released in the UK in 1986. So it's towards the end of this kind of run. It was written by Raymond Biggs, based on his own graphic novel, and the art style is based on his drawings. The 2 characters are a retired couple, and they're voiced by John Mills and Peggy Ashcroft. They're based on his parents, apparently. Oh, there's the cat. He's doing his thing. All right, everybody. The cat wants attention. Are you done? Okay, I think he's done. The director, Jimmy Murakami, is actually an American who had worked in Britain. He did Fred Wolf's The Point, which some people might know. It's based all on Harry Nilsson songs.
Oh, wow. I might want to see that then.
Oh, you've never seen The Point? Yeah, Me and My Arrow. I used to watch it in school because it has a vague educational discourse to it. And I think one of my teachers was a Harry Nilsson fan.
I sure am.
Yeah. I mean, it's the most 70s cartoon you'll ever see. Actually, it's more like a late 60s. I assume it was made because of Yellow Submarine, but I don't know. It's more to it than Yellow Submarine, but he also worked on as supervising animator on Heavy Metal.
Oh, cool. Okay.
He worked on the original Ninja Turtles. He worked for Roger Corman at live action. He co-directed Battle Beyond the Stars with Corman. And
Humanoids from the Deep.
Uncredited rape scenes unfortunately, in Barbara Peters's Humanoids from the Deep.
Right.
So he's an all-around guy, but When the Wind Blows, I would say, is his best but not most famous work. But this is a pretty well-regarded movie in the UK that I didn't know until I started online communications with more people from the UK. And in that regard, it's like other British animated films from the period. It's very slow. It's very understated. It's a little bit wry. It's really mellow, and its pop soundtrack got some big names in it. In this case, Roger Waters did the score with not with Pink Floyd, but with the Bleeding Hearts Band, and it includes songs from David Bowie, Hugh Cornwell, Genesis with Phil Collins,
Wow.
Squeeze, and someone called Paul Hardcastle, whose name I did not recognize. But this is similar to Watership Down had songs by Art Garfunkel.
Sure, yeah.
I believe Plague Dogs had, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I believe Plague Dogs also had a pop song. This was just sort of the way British adult animation, it was a thing for a while there in the 80s. It's tapered off a bit. But like those movies, it's very critical of British society. The young couple, and their names are James and Hilda, they've survived the Second World War, and they are treating the concept of oncoming nuclear war as they think that their stiff upper lips and keep calm and carry on will get them through mutually assured destruction. And again, they live out in the boonies, so they don't experience the immediate bomb drops. And like Threads, this is a war between the USSR and the U.S. that the UK has just sort of become part of. That's kind of a thing that happens in all these movies because there's American Air Force bases, and I guess in Britain's case, they probably would be supporting. They support most of those horrible wars. I don't know if there were British troops in Afghanistan, but I would not be surprised to learn that there were. But they try to do stuff like they have a government-issued Protect and Serve pamphlets, which tells them to... It's not quite as bad as Duck and Cover.
Yeah.
But it's almost as bad, where they tell them to make something called a lean on shelter, which is basically mattresses. Which, mattresses would absorb some radiation, and so would sand. But then they just don't follow the rules to their full degree, so they go under there and they sleep behind their mattress. But then Hilda refuses to stop doing chores. She's such a housewife that she wants to cook, and they don't understand why their food tastes bad. They don't understand why they can't keep any food down.
A little naive. Yeah.
They slowly break down. Their hair falls out. They develop sores, and they're drawn in this very... Have you ever seen The Snowman? That's a
yeah, the Raymond
that
Briggs,
same style.
I think. Yeah.
That's the same style. They're drawn to look like that. So if you picture the characters from The Snowman, the short animated movie, slowly dying. And the thing that they're very sweet. They obviously love each other, so there is a sweetness to it. But they eventually, basically, the movie is just them slowly dying until they die, and that's the movie. And so it doesn't have the bombastic, scary effect that some of these other movies do.
But it's more like a slow,
it's
slow
a
burn.
It's a slow burn to... Oh, good. Now the cat's barfing. Hopefully that doesn't get picked up. It's a slow burn, and it's hard. It's rough to watch, and it's short. It's only 80 minutes, but it feels a lot longer because of what it is.
Sure.
Anyway, so those were the two animated movies released. And so now we're getting a little bit further down, and we're going to cover a movie that I had never seen and was part of the impetus of this podcast because not only Jim told me to see it, but when I was visiting Chicago last time with my friend Tyler found this poster for it's called Miracle Mile, and he said, "Have you ever seen this movie?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh my God, it's great." And then the guy behind the counter said, "Oh yeah, this movie's great. I had a friend who was obsessed with it, and he got his wife obsessed with it, blah blah blah." And everybody was like, "Gabe, how have you not seen this movie?"
It was one of those strange nights.
Finally meet the right girl and you blow it.
That could ruin your whole day. in a big way.
Dad, it's happening. This is it. This is really it. This is the big one.
This is a joke, right?
It's really happening.
This can't be true.
Love can be exciting,
Trust me with this.
even terrifying,
Julie!
I love you.
but nothing could prepare you for an experience like this.
What is the truth, Harry?
Miracle Mile.
Listen, I'm just a guy who picked up the phone.
So even though part of me was saying, I don't know if this fits, because I was looking at the description, I knew we had to cover it. By the end of the movie, I realized it does fit.
And it's funny because it's in stark contrast to how the first act, maybe like the first 15, 20 minutes maybe, where it's a meet cute, essentially.
Yep. And this is so this is from 1998 or 88. Is directed by Steve Jarnatt or Jarnatt. I don't know how he pronounces it. Who co-wrote the Strange Brew movie with Rick Moranis and Dave Thomas, and who had directed 1987 Melanie Griffith's sci-fi action comedy cult movie Cherry 2000, which is a dystopic post-apocalyptic future. But is not a nuclear bomb movie. And I honestly can't remember. I've seen it, but it's one of those movies that there's just this whole pantheon of colorful 80s sci-fi action comedy kind of movies. Like, this movie might as well be Cyborg or The Running Man, or I like The Running Man a lot.
Yeah.
I don't remember Cherry 2000. And I don't know, maybe
I haven't seen it. Maybe I should, because I'm curious to see what this director has done, and I know it has a cult following. So
yeah, I mean, and I remember it being pretty funny, but a lot of it is based on the fact that Melanie Griffith was hot property at the time. But Miracle Mile stars pre-ER Anthony Edwards. I guess he would have already been in Top Gun, but I don't think a lot of people remember him as the guy from Top Gun.
People would probably remember him from Gotcha from 1985.
Yes, indeed. But he's kind of a quintessential 80s nerd character. He's a little bit older than the type you would see in likable nerd, I should say. Not like the kind Revenge of the Nerds, but like, you know, he's like what Anthony Michael Hall from a John Hughes movie had grown up. You know, he was 5-6 years older now, and that kind of situation where he's a likable nerd who, you know, gets along in life. And I don't remember what his job is, but he's probably making money. And yeah, it starts with a meet cute, which I have to say, it takes place in LA, in the surrounding area. And it opens on this meet cute at La Brea Tar Pits. And I had this just absolute nostalgia bomb, because when I was a child, we used to go to Pasadena a couple summers in a row, and I was big into dinosaurs. So my parents would take me to La Brea, and this would have been around 1987, 88 when I went there. So all of the things they do are the exact exhibits that they had when I was a kid.
That's amazing.
So, and I didn't expect that much. Like, I try not to get nostalgia bombs these days. I try to, you know, look forward.
It's hard to separate that though sometimes.
But holy shit, that was weird. That was just weird. And there's even like kids there because there's like a school field trip. But so it starts with this really well done meet cute that runs over the credits basically. And oh god, who's the actress?
Mayor Winningham.
Mayor Winningham. She would have been just out of St. Elmo's Fire.
Yeah.
Where she wasn't a lead, but probably memorable to people.
For sure.
And she's also, I would say, not a typical kind of, like, it's two actors who are very attractive people who are not typical 80s heartthrobs.
Yeah, unconventionally attractive people. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. By Hollywood standards.
Yeah, for sure.
by real world standards, pretty conventionally attractive.
Yeah.
You get what we're saying. And so it really feels like, knowing it's going to be a nuclear movie, it feels like this is going to be a romantic comedy set during a nuclear... Oh, the cat's at it again. Set during a nuclear apocalypse. Mm-hmm. But that's not really what happens here.
It becomes After Hours, in a way.
Yeah, it's
he doesn't
sort of
necessarily have the same kind of surreal, bizarre, absurd interactions, but he comes across some interesting characters.
Yeah, there's like it almost it's such a what's the word? There's such a I'm gonna have to trim part of this because I can't remember the word I'm looking for right here. An artifice.
Okay, yeah.
There's an artifice to this film that it's retro 50s thing going on, and there's a wacky characters. They go into a diner and you're introduced to like 8 or 9 wacky characters, and then very few of them. Does your cat hear my cat? Is that what's happening?
I don't know. But she's definitely like crying in the background, being like, "Hey, what are you doing? Pay attention to me." I think.
Anyway, it really keeps feeling like it's going to be a different movie. Like first, this is going to be a romantic comedy, and then you're like, this is going to be this sort of throwback 50s diner. Like we're going to be in this diner, and we're gonna follow this
group
nuclear thing for this group of people, but really we don't. We hardly see any of them again.
No, it's one of those movies that kind of subverts your expectations
over and over and over,
and in a way that I find very compelling. And I mean, again, there's a lot of history to my own response to this, because it was like I think my dad had rented it from the local video store, not really knowing a whole lot about. I mean, maybe it was a Siskel and Ebert recommendation. I can't remember what compelled him to say, "Hey, let's watch this tonight," and not being prepared for the ride we were about to go on. I mean, I think by this point we'd seen Die Hard, I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just like we did like fast-paced action movies where one guy, goes through a whole lot of shit and has to, figure out what to do and who to trust and how to handle things from moment to moment. So certainly, like, again, the ticking bomb quality of this could have simply have just been a straightforward action thriller, but it becomes a lot more as it goes on.
You get the feeling that the straightforward action thriller is kind of happening outside of our purview.
Yeah.
There's a character played by Denise Crosby who is the absolute most Denise Crosby-ish she could possibly be. Like, I don't know, had she just... I think that... I believe that the Star Trek The Next Generation was in production.
Yeah, I would think so.
She was... she plays a character who just happens to... I should explain. This is one where I don't want to explain plots too much in this podcast, but I should explain that the two main characters have had their first 3 dates, and they've gone well, and they're planning a 3rd date for the middle of the night, and the guy oversleeps. And so he goes to the diner they were supposed to meet. They're supposed to meet at midnight. It's 3 a.m. The girl is so crushed by this that she's taken a Valium to sleep. And he's trying to get a hold of her. And while he's trying to get a hold of her, the phone rings at a payphone, and which was a thing that could happen. I don't know. Maybe I have viewers or readers. Damn it, listeners, young enough that they didn't know that payphones did ring sometimes.
Yes, and you were curious.
They had numbers.
Pick them up.
And so he picks it up, and it's a guy at a missile silo trying to get a hold of his father to tell him that the missiles are coming. And so Anthony Edwards' character, whose name escapes me, Anthony Edwards, I'm just going to call him Anthony Edwards,
Harry,
is trying to figure out, he's trying to figure out what to do with this information. And the Denise Crosby character says, well, can you be more specific? And she has enough connections to senators. I don't remember what her actual job is, but she has connections to senators, and she figures out that this is real.
Yeah, that's very convenient.
Yes,
but
it's that kind of movie,
sure.
and so you get the feeling that her character had an exciting adventure maybe after we lost her, but we lose them. We think that it's going to be a movie about them getting, because she's like, hey, everybody here. I don't know if these are like the only people in the world she knows, because she's such a professional that she doesn't have any significant others. But she's like, let's just go to the airport. I'll get us in a plane and we'll get out of here before the bombs drop. And so there's ticking clock, and we think now at this point we're like, okay, it's not going to be about people dying in a diner, and it's not going to be about the crazy date. I thought this was going to be a movie where the people on a blind date experience all this societal breakdown. That was this feeling I got from trying to read a spoiler-free synopsis. But so then we are already out of this situation, and we think, okay, now he's going to drive with these people and go pick up the girl, but he has to leap out of the car because they're not interested in picking up the girl. And then it becomes a totally different movie. But you get the feeling that the adventure action movie happens then, but we never see any of that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Man, if this could be like adapted for now, it would be an interesting Netflix show where you do get to know what happens to every side character in their own subplot.
Jim, I made myself a note here saying if they remade this, it would have to be a miniseries.
Yeah.
And that might hurt the ticking clock aspect, but I think it would be important. Also, it would not be 50s chic, it would be 80s chic. Unfortunately, I know there's a lot of 80s chic going on right now, but that would be...
No, you think Stranger Things and...
Yeah. Yeah. And it is getting a little old. But, in the 80s, 50s chic got really old, too.
Yeah.
I was young, I was a child at the time, but even I started to really hate shit like Happy Days and all the neon everywhere and how every diner was made to look like it was from 1955. Like, it was a issue like it is now for 80s stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that's something people don't talk about enough. So anyway, like you said, it's a movie that keeps subverting your expectations, and every time you think you know where it's going, another thing happens.
And some genuine surprises and even a shock with, oh my gosh, is it Mykelti? Or Mykelti Williamson, better known as
Yes.
Bubba from Forrest Gump?
Yes. And very young.
Yeah.
He looks exactly the same, but he's young in this.
Yeah, he's really great in this, and I'm still taken aback, even though I've seen everything imaginable in so many horror movies and shocking things. It's just when he just sets the cop on fire and the whole gas station blows up. I'm still like, fuck, that's just nuts. That
and
whole
that
moment.
Scene, I think that there's a part of me that thinks that scene comes too early.
Yeah, I could see that.
I was trying to be more critical of the movie because I was being more critical at the beginning of the movie. By the time I got to the end of the movie, a lot of the things I was critical about, I suddenly realized were part of the texture of the movie. For instance, it starts with a narration.
Right.
And that doesn't follow through. And I was like, what was that about? That was dumb. But I think that was another way of subverting expectations and setting up what we think this movie is going to be, and it just keeps changing what it actually is.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at them at times as detours, but once they, the couple finally meets up again, he's pushing her in a shopping cart, and she's waking up, and it's like, aw, what's going on? Are you taking me out on a nice little rendezvous here? And it's all romantic, and she has, like, this. That's the thing too. Is like I don't know as much with Anthony Edwards' inner life and backstory, because I don't know if we know as much about him, but with Mayor Winningham's, I want to say parents or grandparents.
Yeah, I don't know if they're her parents or grandparents. I'm going to say grandparents.
Yeah, I think so. And, they've been estranged for a while. They've had a rocky relationship. I guess they separated at one point. And so when she gets to see them reunite together, and it's like this really sweet, sentimental moment between the family, it's kind of like, oh, that's nice. It's nice to have like little things like that actually do kind of have some weight to it, as opposed to just like being throwaway scenes or moments. And when you realize, or even when she's confused by what's going on, because he decides not to tell her everything.
He decides
right
not
away.
And that's a little bit of a problem with him deciding not to tell her, because I was never under the impression that she was a particularly fragile person, honestly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, she does take Valium. Who knows?
Yeah. I think that was supposed to be our shorthand for that she had some emotional problems that they didn't really tell us about.
Yeah.
But it's a very tight movie. And, yeah, again, if you remade it, I think the tightness helps. It works in its favor. But if you remade it, you'd have to open it up, I think. And one thing this movie does that the other movies we're talking about don't do, is it really focuses on the idea of what do you take with you emotionally, physically, what people are important when you know a crisis situation is happening. which is something that happens in other disaster movies that doesn't happen in these nuclear disaster movies. Something like the Spielberg War of the Worlds. Some of my favorite scenes in that movie are Tom Cruise deciding what needs to be done, what we need. They need a car. They need the 2 kids. That's all that's really important right now. And in this case, Anthony Edwards decides that this woman is what, even though they've only been on 2 dates, that this is the most important thing, is to make sure to be with her and get her out of there.
And to be selfless in what could potentially be final moments, even though it's like, has there been confirmation? Well, certainly once word gets out, and that's the other thing, that whole moment of society breaking down, and
right, and that's part of why I think the burning scene needed to be moved later, because that society breaking down stuff, the last 15 or so minutes, once the word gets out that bombs are dropping, that stuff's really dark, and really intense. And I think it would have hit even harder if we hadn't already seen some cops.
That's a good point. Yeah, no, that's a good point. I can agree with that. Yeah.
And well, there's also there's a through line here of him not telling people the truth and it backfiring.
Yeah. It shows how fallible he is.
He tells oh god, now I forgot his name too.
McKelty.
He tells him that it's a nuclear meltdown.
Oh, right. That's
so
the plant.
He runs to save his sister at the plant, which leads to him getting shot up by the cops, and his sister dying too.
Oh, yeah.
And he doesn't tell his girlfriend anything, which leads her to leave the launch pad where the helicopter's supposed to be, to go look for a helicopter pilot, because she doesn't understand she just wanders around because she doesn't understand exactly what's happening. And so that, I'm sure that there's some sort of deep down theme of communication breakdown being.
Yeah, no, that's a good point too. Yeah,
which is another thing in disaster movies. Communication breakdowns are always the cause of something like, well, and movies like Failsafe and Doctor Strangelove are all about communication breakdowns.
But they genuinely have good chemistry, and by the end, when everything does happen, you do feel for them, and you do have. I mean, what's going to happen, but at the same time, when it does happen, it does.
I honestly, there were parts where I really thought that they were going to avoid the. I decided I didn't want to look up exactly what happened. I thought that they were going to avoid the actual nuclear blast. I got to the point where I said, okay, they're going to make it, and it's going to be bleak, but they're going to make it, and they definitely do not.
Yeah, and that shock was something my, young adolescent mind was not prepared for.
Was not ready for
at the time.
Yeah, I wouldn't have shown this movie to a child.
Yeah, it was. I think I was. It came out in '88, so I must have been
88.
Probably came out on video a year later, probably 11. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have been 9. Yeah, and like I said, I was a very nervous child, so this would have been a very bad idea.
But it works, and I know this also just came out a couple years ago, or recently, I think, on a pretty nice Blu-ray with commentary and everything that I've been meaning to pick up.
I know that Arrow, I don't know about in the US, but I did almost buy their Arrow Video was having a UK sale, and I have a region-free player, so I almost bought the UK version, but I broke myself down into only buying 4 things, so it didn't match. But I might get it the next time they have their sale.
Yeah, it's rough right now because Barnes & Noble has their Criterion and Arrow sale going on.
And Arrow sales, yep. But it's a movie that is hard to compare to other movies, but also easy to compare to other movies, if that makes any sense. Like, there's a lot of early Michael Mann feel to it too.
Oh, with the score, yeah, for sure.
The Tangerine Dream score, and honestly, the weirdest thing I can say is that the Tangerine Dream score then reminded me of Michele Soavi's Cemetery Man, which has otherwise nothing in common and wasn't Tangerine Dream, but the way the music's used started to remind me of that, and it makes me think that this was a really big movie for filmmakers.
I can see that. Yeah.
And unfortunately, Jarnatt didn't really do much else.
No, he didn't, and
he mostly did TV, and on top of that, he mostly did cable TV at a time when cable TV was not prestigious.
Mm-hmm.
It does say he did some episodes of ER, so I'm wondering if Edwards asked if he could. Like at some point, Edwards was had enough power in making ER that he said, "Look, my friend who helped me get in, this movie that nobody's seen. I want him to direct some episodes." That's just a guess.
I wonder where Anthony Edwards is nowadays. I know last time we saw him in Zodiac, which he had a small role in that.
He was in. He played the judge in the Menendez brothers, and it was NBC, I think.
Oh, okay.
He plays the asshole judge. That's the last thing I saw him in. He mostly plays assholes these days.
Interesting. So likable.
He went from likable dork to, But yeah, I highly recommend this movie if you haven't seen it. Now that I've seen it, I understand why people kept on recommending it to me. So yeah, it's a little bit of kind of everything that made up the mid and late 80s in as far as motion pictures.
Yeah,
American
it's a good summation of that era in a way. Mm-hmm. It has a little bit of everything, and yeah, this one's just got a special place in my heart for, this was a bonding experience with my dad that we both shared, and we're kind of like, great, now we're going to have nightmares of nuclear annihilation. And because that was one thing too, is like we would sometimes wake up the next morning and be like, did you have a tornado dream last night? I'm like, yeah, I did. It was weird. We would sometimes share those dreams and knew like, this movie really messed us up, and in a good way.
In a good way. Yeah, see, my dad, when my mom would be out of town, his idea of sneaking a movie, we would watch Big Trouble in Little China.
Good choice.
Which was his kind of... I just found out pretty recently, his favorite movie to watch was Buckaroo Banzai.
Makes sense.
So I actually, even though, again, neither of my parents are really cult movie people, but this was just some movie he had seen that he liked. I'm sure he was high at the time. And so he would watch that, and I just found out recently that Buckaroo Banzai and Big Trouble in Little China shared a writer. So
that makes complete sense.
There you go. And I had no idea those weren't popular movies until I got much older. I just assumed everybody's dad made them watch those two movies.
Well, they're perfect examples of genre mashups that have a really weird sense of humor that managed to work.
And honestly, Big Trouble in Little China kind of fits in a weird way with Miracle Mile. They have very little in common thematically, but there's just this sort of what made the 80s vibe. Like there's just so much shoved into them. That they have the same kind of... But I guess Big Trouble in Little China has a star lead. It makes sense.
Yeah.
But still. And I am not surprised to find out Miracle Mile was not a hit. It makes sense that this was not really what people wanted to see at the time. I don't know what else came out in 1988 off the top of my head, but...
Plenty of things.
Wasn't that... I believe Honey, I Shrunk the Kids came out. That was a big hit in 88. This is definitely a different level than that. I also think by 88...
Die Hard came out, didn't it? That was the
Die
big
Hard
one.
came out in 88. So Die Hard, Big Trouble in Little China would have been 85. Die Hard and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids are kind of not this level. I also think that nuclear... I think that this kind of fear had faded a lot by then. And again, like we said, in part thanks to these movies. Things are de-escalating. Also, the USSR was dying at this point. So that made a difference too. But I should say that the other movie we were going to cover, you didn't get a chance to watch. I actually just finished watching it a couple hours ago, which came out in 1984. That's sort of along the same lines. Is called One Night Stand. It's a Australian movie. You said you watched some of it.
Yeah, it didn't quite grab me in the way I had hoped. There's this movie called Last Night from like 1998, which is just about this group of eccentric characters dealing with the fact that the world's going to end. I don't even remember what the cause of it is. I don't think it had anything to do with nuclear bomb scare or anything, but it was just one of those like ensembles of eccentric people hanging out and trying to decide, well, what were we going to do on our last night on Earth? And I just like the vibe I got from this was just it seemed a little bit too quirky or something for my liking.
This one really doesn't know how. It does not. It has too many tones.
Yeah, that's what it felt like.
And I say this as someone who loves movies that change gears.
Sure. No, I do too, and that's part of me was like, I should finish it, but maybe I don't know if I'm going to connect with this in the long run. But at the same time, this director has made some really good films like Flirting and The Year My Voice Broke.
But this is as Australian. I don't know if I made that
right.
clear. This is an Australian movie, and it's a really Australian movie, to the point where the characters go on a date at the beginning and they go to a Midnight Oil concert.
Oh my gosh, you can't get more Australian than that.
I mean, you can't get more Australian, and you can't get more anti-nuclear bomb than Midnight Oil on top of that. Like, it's so on the nose.
Oh crap, though. It's funny because on Letterboxd I just read a quick review that said this would make a nice double feature with Miracle Mile. I'm like, no.
It kind of works. This is much more what I thought Miracle Mile was going to be.
Okay.
Which is, you meet two male characters at the beginning, and they go on this date with these two girls they've run into. They're dressed as Santa Clauses. Part of the Australianness of it all being that Christmas happens in summertime in Australia. But one of those characters disappears immediately, and the other one actually works at the Sydney Opera House, and the girls kind of sneak in.
Okay.
And meanwhile, a U.S. Navyman has run away, and he's also hiding out. He's been hiding out in the Sydney Opera House for some reason. It seems like the type of movie where somebody said, "Hey, we got a permit to shoot 5 days in the Sydney Opera House. We need a script based around the Sydney Opera House," because they're all over it. And so it has a little bit of original Dawn of the Dead vibe, where they're just like, here, we have a mall. Let's shoot people doing stuff in a mall when no one else is around. But it's more along the lines of, what if there was an Australian John Hughes movie?
Okay.
That was interrupted by a nuclear bomb. Patrick, our friend Patrick, who I will be doing the next podcast with, has a thing that I don't know if this is his original saying or if he took it from somewhere, but he says the best slasher movies are teen sex comedies that are interrupted by a serial killer.
Yeah.
This is a teen sex comedy that's interrupted by not even a teen sex comedy, but a teen comedy. It's much closer to something like Breakfast Club, where these characters are dealing with their who they are as people because they're young still, and there's a lot of flashbacks that felt very very artsy. Like, there'll be flashbacks to things they've done throughout their life, either bullying people or being bullied themselves, that just felt very John Hughes meets Peter Weller. Not Peter Weller. Peter Weller's RoboCop. Peter Weir. There's, you get the feeling that Peter Weir had a big effect on Australian directors at the time.
Yeah, part of me thinks this does sound like something I would like. It felt really silly. I mean, maybe I just didn't go with it long enough.
It's stilted. It feels stilted. It's mature in the way it's more mature than a lot of American teen movies in the way it deals with sex, but it's also very it's very wordy in the way it has them talk about things. Like, there's a pretty good scene where they're like, they've learned that they have to stay inside because bombs might be dropping. And again, it's interesting to follow a movie from a different country's point of view.
Yeah.
Being that all these other countries were stuck in the middle of this war between the US and USSR that at any point could destroy the world. And they had no say in the situation, which makes me wish there were more movies from this point of view. But there's only the three I can think of. I suppose the Japanese Hiroshima movies were a reaction saying, look at what happen to us, this, that kind of
Yeah.
thing. But there's an interesting thing that, so they're in Australia, so they keep talking like, well, are we going to be a part of this? And because there's an American naval officer as one of the characters, he's saying yes, because you have American naval bases here, you are a target. But there's a part where the kids like don't know what to do, and so they read their horoscopes, and they discover all their horoscopes, if they're read in a certain way, are super bleak that day. And then they talk about religion in a way that feels really forced, but I understand. The whole movie felt forced, but I understood what they were going for, that kind of situation. It's like a 3-star movie that if you took another go at it would be a 4-star movie kind of situation.
Yeah, that's what it seemed like. And
it's definitely the bottle episode situation that we were talking about way earlier, where it's trying to use the limited, like, there's the cool thing, they're in an opera house, so the girls keep changing into costumes. Like it really good ideas that just aren't quite coming together.
Okay.
I suppose it's another movie that is ripe for a remake because the ideas are good. And it doesn't have to be the 80s. There's nothing about it that, other than the Cold War part, I guess, that makes it really, really 80s. Maybe it's just because it's Australian that their version of 80s was slightly different.
Yeah, and just don't get it confused with the One Night Stand with Wesley Snipes.
Yeah. There's actually like 8 movies called that, and this is like the 3rd that comes up when you do a search.
Oh, jeez.
So yeah, look for the one that's 1984 if you're looking into this. I had to download a bootleg version. I couldn't find it otherwise. I don't know where you saw it. Did you find it on YouTube?
I think so. I think it was like a VHS rip on YouTube.
Yeah, this was also so it's probably the same VHS rip. I just downloaded it instead of watching it on YouTube. I should have looked harder on YouTube. It's an interesting movie that if if someone's looking into watching all these movies, I wouldn't recommend against it. And then there's, of course, a lot of Australian movies about nuclear warfare, but it's because Mad Max. It's actually because Mad Max 2. It was because The Road Warrior is the one that is definitely after a nuclear apocalypse. They had one called Ground Zero from 1987 about that sounds really bleak, about the Australian government testing nukes on Aboriginal people.
Ooh.
And they have a pretty good action movie by Ian Barry called Chain Reaction from 1980 that was made in lieu of the Mad Max movies, but is kind of its own thing. That one ends with them stopping the nuclear thing. And then, of course, there's 4 Mad Max movies of varying quality.
Yeah, and one movie that kind of came to mind, although obviously it doesn't happen, but it certainly covers the Cold War era, is Joe Dante's Matinee, when a number of people are thinking the end is near, and everybody has different reactions to it, and it all takes place in it doesn't all take place in a movie theater, but a lot of it does for sure. That I consider to be a favorite of mine, especially in the work of Dante.
Yeah, it's Dante's best non-horror movie, I would say. And actually, now that you said it, that would make a good double feature with Miracle Mile, but you'd have to watch it first.
Yeah, that would definitely be a good double feature. I hadn't thought of that before, but yeah. I wasn't too crazy about this one. I think maybe because it was too talky, but 13 Days with Costner.
Yeah, I haven't seen that for a very long time, but I remember it being a good made-for-TV movie that ended up in theaters.
Yeah, that's kind of my feelings. Or it could have been a really good. It might have been based on a stage play. I wouldn't be surprised.
It wouldn't be. Yeah. Another fun factoid about that movie is I guess the guy who played Robert Kennedy has played Robert Kennedy in multiple things because he looks exactly like Robert Kennedy.
Yeah. And one thing that sort of ties to the beginning with my question that that just occurred to me, because I was really hoping to do this sort of side project podcast that I know that I think Mike White of the Projection Booth might be responsible for, but it's going through all the Twilight Zone episodes from the 80s. And one of the first ones I vividly remember stars Melinda Dillon, who finds this locket buried in her backyard. and has the ability to stop time when she wears the locket. All she has to do is say "shut up," and time freezes, and she can just take all her groceries and steal them, and do a lot of fun things with stopping time. But it ends on a really terrifying, horrific note that, again, in my childhood brain, the final image is of a nuclear bomb or a nuclear missile in the air, in the sky. And she says, of course, "shut up," when she finds out that basically the world's about to end. And so she basically has to wander the earth for the rest of her life entirely alone. Because if she's able to, get time going again, that means the bomb is going to hit. So it's this really horribly bleak, sad ending. And the final shot of the missile in the sky, if you watch it now, it's the cheesiest looking thing you'll ever see.
In fact, I remember both the 80s Twilight Zone and what was that Spielberg
Amazing
show?
Stories?
Having the worst special effects.
Yeah, they did. I mean, they had some great episodes and great stories, and there's a lot of great I think Wes Craven might have even directed that episode that I'm talking about.
That would make that makes sense.
And it's really good.
I should mention, according to the IMDb factoids, I almost forgot to say that Miracle Mile was for a while planned as an episode in the Twilight Zone movie, or as the basis for the Twilight Zone movie. And at some point, Spielberg came on, and then it changed to be a episodic thing with all-star directors.
Wow.
So the script had been sitting there for a while, obviously. And I guess they decided that wouldn't. So what I'm wondering is if it would have been a Twilight Zone movie, would we have followed those other characters more?
That's a good point, yeah.
And also there would have had to have been a twist. So I don't know what the hell the twist would have been, but there has to be a twist in a Twilight Zone story.
Yeah.
The other movie I watched for this, which just didn't fit and is also way too dense to go into here, is a Russian movie called Dead Man's Letters. And I'm not going to try to pronounce the Russian title. We learned that lesson with the Witch Movie podcast. It was released in 1986, which is 5 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union and 1 year before The Day After was shown on Soviet television. And it's really a post-apocalyptic science fiction movie. I wouldn't call it a cyberpunk movie, but it has stuff in common with cyberpunk movies. It's on YouTube if you can find it. There were 2 different subtitle versions on there. I kept on finding ones that were actually music videos that people had made because the imagery is so amazing that people just add techno music to it and it works perfectly. And it looks older than it is. It looks like a silent film because it's monochromatic. There'll be one scene that's just orange tones, and there'll be another scene that's just blue tones. So it is definitely worth seeing, and it's bleak. But it's bleak in a different way, and it's interesting to see a Soviet version of this story.
Yeah, that's definitely been one of the highlights for me in general, going through, just the different countries and the different interpretations or portrayals. And even there's, some similarities between something like Threads and The Day After, but just...
Well, even this is following a small group of people again. It's about finding groups of people. So many of these movies are about small group of people, not government employees, not soldiers, just normal people having to deal with the problem. I think that's a key aspect that makes this sort of little pantheon we've tried to make out of, like we keep saying, there are other movies that fit, but also don't fit. And I think in trying to make them fit, that's one of the key elements to this supposed genre, is that it follows people who aren't in charge. But that brings us to the end. Again, I was going to cover some more Japanese movies, but I just think that there's something separate that either I'll cover at a different time or write something up about. So I would like to thank Jim.
Well, thank you, Gabe, for having me on. I know I mostly wanted to come on to sing the praises of Miracle Mile, but at the same time, watching Threads finally and seeing something like Testament really enhanced this experience and made me appreciate some titles that I had yet to catch up with, and I'm glad that I did. And Special Bulletin too. That's another one that I
think Special Bulletin is the big recommendation for me. Special Bulletin, Threads, and if you're into performance, Testament for sure.
Yeah, I would agree.
And do you have anything that you want to? Any other stuff you're going to be doing that you want to advertise on here?
I don't know exactly. It's funny because I've gotten some interview possibilities that I would be excited about, but there hasn't been follow through, even though I've expressed interest, including maybe another conversation with Keith Gordon. I think the last time we talked about underrated 90s movies that he thinks people should see, and I said, well, why don't we just go back, on a yearly basis, and next time we'll talk about the 80s. And he's been really kind, and it's like, I've been busy, and obviously I'm shooting some TV shows or whatever, and it just hasn't happened, but I'm hoping that's going to happen, so people can go to voicesvisions.net. At the very least, there's 75 episodes or so of cool interviews that people can check out that I've done over the years, and I'm proud of all the work Patrick and I have done at Directors Club, obviously, and I'm trying not to be as active on social media just because I have a lot of other things going on, like going back to school to hopefully become a librarian and do archiving and things like that. I could see myself being a music librarian of some kind, maybe.
Most libraries in major cities do have fallout shelters.
Good. Yeah. I wouldn't. Honestly, the one I'm working at now is one of the oldest and certainly the biggest in all of Chicago. It's the Harold Washington Library, downtown, 10 floors, and there are books from the 1800s there. There's just a lot of rich history and a lot of weird hallways that lead into something I'm picturing an entire movie could take place in this library. So I'm happy to be focusing on that at the moment, and just trying to do some writing more. I was recently published in McGill's Cinema Annual, which is a movie review reference guide that pretty much only colleges and libraries get, but Video Hound is a part of that. And
okay. Yep, I'm familiar with video.
So I finally did some writing, and I finally get paid. It's more of a freelance thing. I know there's some critics who do 30, 40 reviews, where I just do maybe 10, 15 a year at the most. But it's nice to be published, and I'm glad things are staying active, but certainly not to the way they used to be in the world of podcasting for me.
Right. Okay, so you are on social media, but you aren't on.
No, you can find me at Letterboxd, and maybe I'll pop on Twitter once in a while. Now playing Jim, and for the most part, I just want people to check out all the great shows like yours at nowplayingnetwork.net. Yeah,
Jim. He's on Letterboxd as Jim Laczkowski. I'm friends with him. If you're friends with me, you could probably find him. And I can be reached at Gabe Powers. I can be reached at genregrinder. I can be reached at the genregrinder.com website in the comment section. Or I can be reached at genregrinder@gmail.com if you have some question that you don't want anybody else to see, which would be weird, but whatever. So I think the next one I'm going to be recording with Patrick again, and we're gonna cover slasher movies, and I'm trying to find ways to compact slasher movies, and the closest I could come is just movies that were released in 1981.
That's exciting.
That's still 40 some movies.
Whew.
So that might end up being a two-parter. I don't know yet, but we'll see what happens. So until next time, thanks again to Jim.
Thank you.
And we'll see you later.
Dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum, beetle dum dum. There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and Bert the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He ducked and covered, ducked and covered.
He did what we all must learn to do. You and you and you and you.